Picture yourself standing at the base of an ancient pyramid, feeling the immense weight of history in those perfectly cut stones rising toward the sky. You marvel at the precision, the alignment to the stars, the sheer human ambition it represents. But what if I told you there's another architect behind this marvel, one that breathed across the desert for millennia, shaping not just the sand, but the very empires that rose from it? This invisible force, the desert wind, carried more than just dust. It carried the destiny of civilizations, guiding builders, traders, and rulers in ways they never fully understood. We often credit human genius alone for these wonders, but today we're pulling back the curtain on history's silent partner, the wind. Throughout time, desert winds have been the unseen hands that molded our world. From the relentless Shamal winds of Mesopotamia to the dry Khamsin of Egypt, these currents did more than just sculpt dunes. They dictated where cities could thrive, how water would flow, and which trade routes would prosper. They cooled palaces, directed the spread of ideas, and even influenced the fall of empires, all while remaining hidden in plain sight. This isn't just a story about weather. It's about how nature's subtlest rhythms guided humanity's greatest achievements, leaving clues in stone and sand that we're only now beginning to decode. So join me on a journey across continents and centuries as we explore how wind patterns shaped entire civilizations without anyone noticing. We'll walk through narrow gorges designed to harness the breeze, uncover ancient technologies that turned desert gusts into life-giving comfort, and see how empires from Egypt to Persia built their legacies on a foundation of air and motion. By the end, you'll never look at history or a windy day the same way again. This is a tale written not in books, but in the very architecture of our past, waiting for us to listen to what the wind has to say. To truly grasp how these invisible forces shaped history, we first need to understand the desert wind itself. Think of it not as a random weather event, but as a constant, powerful river of air flowing over the planet's vast arid regions. These winds are born from the intense heating of the sun-baked earth. The sand and rock absorb tremendous heat during the day, warming the air above it and causing it to rise rapidly. This creates areas of low pressure that pull in cooler, denser air from surrounding regions, setting in motion a relentless cycle of circulation that can last for days or even entire seasons. Each major desert has its own distinct wind personality, a character forged by the unique geography of the land. The Shamal, for instance, which means north in Arabic, is a northwesterly wind that blows over Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. It's not a gentle breeze, it's a persistent, powerful force that can last for days, lifting immense amounts of fine dust and sand into the atmosphere, reducing visibility to almost nothing and scouring everything in its path. Then there's Egypt's Khamsin, a hot, dry and dusty wind that blows from the south in the spring. Its name comes from the Arabic word for 50, as it was said to blow for 50 days, bringing with it a noticeable rise in temperature and a blanket of dust that could seep into the smallest crevices of homes and monuments. Further west, the Sirocco blows northward from the Sahara across the Mediterranean, picking up moisture and becoming a humid, oppressive wind that reaches southern Europe. And from the east, the Harmattan sweeps off the Sahara and across West Africa, a dry and dusty trade wind that can carry its signature red dust all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. These winds are the primary sculptors of the desert landscape. They don't just move sand, they build and shape the dunes, erode rock formations into surreal shapes, and constantly redistribute the very ground beneath your feet. This endless movement creates microclimates, pockets of slightly different environmental conditions. A dune field might absorb and radiate heat differently than a rocky plateau, creating localized wind patterns. A mountain range can force winds to accelerate through a narrow pass or create a rain shadow on its leeward side, making one area fertile and another utterly barren. It was these subtle variations in the landscape, carved by the wind, that determined the most fundamental aspects of survival. Where could a spring emerge? Where would sand dunes not bury a fledgling settlement? Where would the wind itself provide natural ventilation to make the oppressive heat bearable? The availability of water, the single most critical resource, was also dictated by these aerial currents. Wind patterns influence evaporation rates, determining how quickly a reservoir or an irrigation channel might lose its precious content. They carry rain clouds, but more often they bring drought. The direction of the wind could mean the difference between a successful harvest and a devastating famine, as it dictated which fields would receive life-giving rain and which would be buried under a layer of sterile sand. Perhaps most fascinatingly, these winds became the invisible highways for the spread of culture and innovation. The same predictable wind patterns that traders relied upon to cross vast deserts also carried with them the seeds of ideas. A building technique developed in Persia to catch a cool breeze could be carried on the wind along trade routes to North Africa. The knowledge of when to plant crops based on seasonal wind shifts was exchanged at desert oases. The wind was the constant, unseen companion to every caravan, every explorer, and every conqueror, subtly guiding their paths and the flow of human history itself. Empires did not consciously decide to obey the wind. Instead, through generations of trial and error, they learned to adapt to its rhythms. Their successes and failures were, in many ways, a response to the demands of this invisible architect. The placement of a city, the design of a temple, the route of a road, all of these were silent negotiations with the relentless, shaping force of the desert wind. Now, let's set our sights on the first great empire to master this invisible art, ancient Egypt. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization flourished along the narrow, fertile ribbon of the Nile, a stark contrast to the vast deserts that hemmed it in on both sides. This geographical setup created a unique wind tunnel effect. The relentless sun beating down on the surrounding Sahara heated the air, causing it to rise, while the cooler air over the Mediterranean Sea was drawn in to replace it. This resulted in a remarkably consistent north wind that blew down the Nile Valley, a natural force that became the lifeblood of the empire. Imagine the Nile as a bustling ancient highway. While the river's current naturally flows north toward the sea, that dependable north wind provided the perfect counterforce. Egyptian sailors could hoist their sails and be pushed south, upstream against the current, with incredible efficiency. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a strategic masterpiece. It meant trade goods, precious cedar wood from Byblos, incense from Punt, gold from Nubia, could move reliably throughout the kingdom. More importantly, it allowed for the rapid deployment of troops and officials, enabling the pharaoh's central government to maintain control over a territory that stretched for hundreds of miles. The wind effectively shrank the empire, making it manageable and interconnected in a way that would have been impossible otherwise. This understanding of the wind extended far beyond transportation and deeply into urban planning. The locations of major cities like Thebes and Memphis weren't chosen by accident. Planners intuitively selected sites where the architecture could work in concert with the prevailing breezes. Grand palaces and temples were oriented to capture the north wind, funneling it through columned halls and open courtyards to provide natural air conditioning long before the concept existed. The design was deliberate. Narrow entrances on the windward side would accelerate the incoming air, while larger, open spaces on the leeward side would allow the hot, stale air to escape. This created a continuous flow of ventilation, cooling the stone interiors and providing relief from the oppressive heat for priests, nobles, and artisans alike. It was a passive cooling system of brilliant simplicity, engineered not with machinery but with stone and an intimate knowledge of the environment. We can see this wind wisdom etched into the very stones of their most iconic structures. Take the magnificent temple of Karnak, for instance. While its alignment is often discussed in relation to the sun or stars, a closer look reveals its dialogue with the wind. The main axis of the temple complex and the positioning of its towering pylons show a keen awareness of the dominant north wind. This orientation served a crucial, practical purpose. It minimized the accumulation of wind-blown sand and dust within the sacred precincts. By aligning the massive walls and gateways parallel to the wind's primary direction, architects reduced the amount of abrasive sand that could settle on altars, clog courtyards, and slowly erode the elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about preservation, ensuring the temple's grandeur would endure for centuries. The wind's role was so seamlessly integrated into the design that it became invisible, a silent partner in maintaining the sanctity and structure of these holy sites. This deep, albeit unspoken, collaboration with the wind was a cornerstone of Egypt's legendary longevity. For millennia, the civilization endured, and its architectural resilience is a testament to building with nature rather than against it. The comfort provided by well-ventilated homes and palaces, the reliability of wind-powered trade and communication, and the enduring nature of sand-minimized monuments all contributed to a stable and prosperous society. The Egyptians may have attributed their success to the gods, and indeed they had a deity, Shu, who personified the wind and air, but their daily reality was shaped by a pragmatic and sophisticated adaptation to the invisible currents that flowed through their land. Their architecture stands as a silent testament to this wisdom, a permanent record of how an empire can thrive by listening to the whispers of the wind. Leaving the Nile Valley behind, we journey now to the Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the world's first cities took root. Here, the Mesopotamian empires faced a different kind of wind challenge. Unlike Egypt's predictable north breeze, they contended with the Shamal, a powerful northwesterly wind that could rage for days, whipping up violent dust storms capable of burying fields and choking entire settlements. This relentless environmental pressure didn't break the Mesopotamian spirit. It forged it, leading to a suite of architectural and engineering innovations so clever they feel almost modern. The very layout of their cities reveals a deep, intuitive understanding of wind dynamics. Urban planners working without formal meteorological data learned to orient entire city grids to mitigate the Shamal's fury. Wide, straight avenues weren't just for grand processions. They were carefully aligned to channel the prevailing winds, creating ventilation corridors that swept dust and stale air out of the densely populated urban centers. This strategic placement of streets and buildings effectively turned the city itself into a giant air filtration system, improving public health and livability in a climate that was often brutally hot and dusty. Nowhere is this wind-conscious design more evident than in their most sacred structures, the ziggurats. These massive stepped pyramids, like the Great Ziggurat of Ur, were not just spiritual centers reaching for the heavens, they were also feats of environmental engineering. Their imposing, towering forms were strategically positioned, and their stepped profiles meticulously designed to act as monumental windbreaks. By interrupting the wind's flow, they protected the temple complexes at their summits and the surrounding administrative districts from the full force of erosion and dust accumulation. The orientation of their staircases and the angles of their tiers weren't arbitrary. They were calculated to deflect the wind's energy upward and around the structure, ensuring that the sacred rituals above could continue even as a dust storm swirled below. It was a divine fortress built as much against the elements as it was for the gods, but the most breathtaking Mesopotamian innovation born from this battle with the wind is undoubtedly the wind catcher or badger. This ingenious architectural feature, which first appeared in this region, is arguably one of the earliest forms of non-mechanical air conditioning. The principle is stunningly simple yet effective. A tower, often topped with vents oriented to capture the prevailing wind, would project above a building's roof. As the wind was funneled down the shaft, it would be cooled by the thermal mass of the structure's thick walls and then directed into the living spaces below. Simultaneously, this incoming flow would create pressure that pushed the hot, stagnant air out through other openings, establishing a continuous cycle of cooling ventilation. In a city like Babylon, with its teeming population and legendary hanging gardens, such technology was not a luxury. It was a necessity that allowed urban life to flourish at a scale previously unimaginable in such an arid environment. What's truly fascinating is that these advancements were rarely, if ever, recorded as direct responses to the wind. Ancient texts might credit a king's divine inspiration or an engineer's genius, but the true catalyst was the relentless, empirical process of adaptation. Builders observed what worked over generations. They saw which buildings accumulated less sand, which layouts felt cooler, and which designs stood firm against the seasonal storms. This accumulated, unspoken knowledge was then encoded into their architectural language, becoming a standard practice rather than a celebrated invention. This resilience, this ability to innovate silently in the face of environmental pressure, is what truly defined the Mesopotamian marvel. They didn't conquer the wind, they learned to dance with it, and in doing so, they built some of the most enduring and sophisticated cities the ancient world had ever seen. Moving east from Mesopotamia, we arrive at the heart of one of history's most expansive and sophisticated empires, ancient Persia. Governing a vast territory that stretched from the edges of India to the coasts of Greece, the Persians mastered the art of ruling diverse landscapes, but their greatest challenge and their most brilliant triumph lay in their own arid homeland. The Iranian plateau is a land of stark extremes, with searing summer heat and limited, unpredictable rainfall. Survival here, let alone building an empire, demanded a revolutionary approach to harnessing the one resource that dictated life and death: water. Their solution, born from centuries of necessity, was the Qanat system, a breathtaking feat of underground engineering that simply could not have functioned without a silent partner: the desert wind. A Qanat is not merely a tunnel. It is a gently sloping subterranean aqueduct that taps into a water-bearing aquifer, often at the base of a mountain range, and channels this precious resource through gravity alone over vast distances to the arid plains below. The construction was a monumental task. Teams of skilled workers, known as muqanis, would dig a series of vertical access shafts down to the water table, and then meticulously connect them with the gently sloping tunnel. These shafts, which pockmark the desert landscape like a series of ancient craters, served a dual purpose. They provided oxygen and removal routes for the excavated earth during construction, but their true, lasting genius was for ventilation. This is where the wind enters the story. The constant, dry winds sweeping across the desert surface would flow down into these shafts, creating a natural circulation of air throughout the entire underground network. This perpetual breeze was absolutely vital. It prevented the stagnant, humid air that would otherwise lead to the growth of algae and bacteria, safeguarding the water quality for the communities that depended on it. It also supplied fresh air to the maintenance crews who would periodically descend to clear blockages and repair the tunnel walls, ensuring the Qanats' longevity for centuries. The wind, in essence, was the invisible custodian of this entire life-giving system, a natural pump preserving the health of the water and the men who maintained it. This profound understanding of aerodynamics extended far beyond the hidden world of water tunnels and into the very heart of Persian urban design. In magnificent ceremonial capitals like Persepolis, architects designed structures to actively collaborate with the climate. While the famous Apadana Palace with its towering columns is awe-inspiring, its true sophistication is found in subtler details. The strategic placement of windows, vents, and high ceilings was not accidental. It was a deliberate system for catching and channeling the prevailing winds. By creating carefully calculated pressure differences throughout the grand halls, they could scoop the breeze from one side of a building and funnel it through living and working spaces, providing a constant, cooling airflow that mitigated the intense heat. This passive cooling transformed these vast stone complexes from potential ovens into habitable, even comfortable, centers of administration and power. It was architecture as climate control, and it allowed the Persian elite to conduct the business of a global empire in a state of dignified comfort. The empire's staggering expansion itself was subtly guided by these environmental forces. The routes chosen for the Royal Road, the famous highway that connected the empire from Susa to Sardis, were undoubtedly influenced by the availability of water provided by Qanats and the feasibility of travel. Moving large armies and trade caravans required reliable stopping points, and these were invariably established where water and manageable wind conditions existed. Settling in areas with predictable, favorable winds meant safer journeys, more reliable communication, and stable agricultural outposts to supply the troops. This wind-facilitated mobility was the backbone of imperial control, enabling not just conquest but the crucial exchange of ideas, art, and technology that held the diverse empire together. The wind, therefore, was an unseen enabler of Persian cultural and political stability, its influence woven into the very logistics of hegemony. The Persians may have attributed their success to the wisdom of their kings and the favor of Ahura Mazda, but a strong, silent wind was always at their back, filling the sails of their ambition and breathing life into their desert cities. Nestled deep within the rugged canyons of southern Jordan lies a city that seems to defy the very logic of the desert. Petra, the legendary capital of the Nabatean Empire, appears as if it were a mirage, a breathtaking collection of temples, tombs, and theaters hewn directly from the rose-red sandstone cliffs. For centuries, visitors have marveled at its beauty, attributing its existence to sheer human determination and artistic genius. But look closer, beyond the intricate facades and the famous treasury, and you begin to see the subtle, brilliant hand of another master architect at work, the desert wind itself. The Nabateans didn't just build a city in the desert, they engineered it in concert with the air that flowed through it, creating a hidden masterpiece of environmental adaptation. Your first encounter with this wind wisdom comes before you even see a single carved building. The main entrance to Petra is through the Siq, a magnificent, narrow gorge that snakes for over a kilometer through towering rock walls. This wasn't just a dramatic pathway chosen for its grandeur, it was a meticulously designed natural wind tunnel. As the prevailing winds sweep across the open desert, they are funneled into this constricted channel. The laws of physics take over here as the same volume of air is forced through a smaller space. Its velocity increases dramatically. This creates a powerful, constant breeze that flows through the Siq and into the heart of the city. For a traveler arriving on a scorching day, this would have been the first taste of Nabatean luxury, a natural air conditioning system that provided immediate cooling relief. But its function was far more critical than mere comfort. This accelerated wind served as a natural cleaning service, scouring the pathway and the city's open areas of loose sand and dust. By ensuring that sand was constantly being blown through and out of the urban center, the Nabateans drastically reduced the maintenance needed to keep their city from being slowly buried by the encroaching desert. The Sikh, therefore, was not just an entrance, it was the first and most vital component of Petra's climate control system. This sophisticated understanding extended to the most precious resource in the desert, water. The Nabateans were brilliant hydrologists, carving elaborate channel systems into the cliff sides to capture and redirect every possible drop of rainwater from the surrounding highlands. But in a windy desert, any open water channel faces a constant threat siltation. Wind-blown sand and debris can quickly clog and fill these channels, rendering them useless. The Nabatean engineers solved this with astonishing foresight. They designed their water systems with a deep understanding of aeolian or wind-driven sediment transport. Channels were often carved directly into the rock or covered with stone slabs in areas most exposed to the wind. More impressively, they constructed subtle deflection walls and settling basins at strategic points. These features were positioned based on wind patterns. They would cause the wind to drop its load of sand before it reached the water channels, effectively filtering the air around their water supply. The inlets to these channels were also carefully oriented away from the prevailing wind direction to prevent direct ingress of debris. This ensured that the water flowing into the city's numerous cisterns and reservoirs was remarkably clean, and the channels themselves required minimal clearing, guaranteeing a reliable year-round water supply that could support a population of tens of thousands. This mastery of their environment translated directly into economic and political power. Petra's location was no accident. It sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, linking the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia with the markets of the Mediterranean. Frankincense and myrrh, more valuable than gold, flowed through this city. The Nabateans grew immensely wealthy by controlling this trade, and their ability to thrive in such an arid environment was their ultimate strategic advantage. They could support large numbers of merchants, guards, and artisans with their hidden water and cooling systems, while rival powers would struggle to mount a prolonged siege or even maintain a permanent presence in the harsh surrounding desert. Their prosperity, etched into the very rock, was built on an unspoken dialogue with the wind. The magnificent facades of the treasury or the monastery are what capture the eye, but their true genius lies in the invisible engineering, the calculated angles of a wall that deflects a dust storm, the placement of a window that catches a cool breeze, the orientation of a street that remains clear of drifts. The Nabateans didn't just carve a city out of rock, they sculpted a civilization with the wind, and their greatest secrets are whispered not in the guidebooks, but in the gentle currents that still flow through the Sikh today. From the hidden rock-cut city of Petra, we now travel west to the shores of North Africa, where the might of Rome met the unyielding force of the Sahara. The Roman Empire, famous for imposing its will and its architectural style on conquered lands, is often portrayed as a force of homogenization, stamping out local idiosyncrasies with standardized grids and engineering. But in provinces like Numidia, a different story emerges, one of subtle, intelligent adaptation. Here, the pragmatic Romans, masters of absorbing useful ideas, encountered a climate so demanding that even their formidable building codes had to bend to the will of the wind. They didn't just build Roman cities in Africa, they learned to build African Roman cities, and the evidence is written in the stone ruins of places like Timgad. Founded around the year 100 by Emperor Trajan, Timgad was a classic example of Roman urban planning at its most precise, a perfect square laid out in a rigid grid pattern, the iconic Cardo and Decumanus intersecting at the Forum. This orderly design, replicated across the empire from Britain to Syria, was a symbol of Roman control and civilization. But in North Africa, this standard template was cleverly modified for a very specific local challenge. Archaeologists studying the site have noticed something fascinating. The entire city's grid is not aligned to true north, as one might expect. Instead, it is rotated by approximately 20 degrees. This wasn't a surveying error. It was a calculated decision to align the long, straight streets with the prevailing northeastern winds. This orientation transformed the city's avenues into powerful ventilation ducts. The wind would sweep down these broad streets, effectively scouring them of the fine, abrasive dust that constantly threatened to infiltrate every home and public building. By channeling the wind rather than blocking it, the Romans significantly improved air quality and reduced the suffocating dust that was a fact of life in the desert frontier, turning a potential nuisance into a municipal cleaning service. This wind-aware philosophy extended to their most critical infrastructure, water management. The Romans were legendary hydraulic engineers, and North Africa is dotted with the remains of their magnificent aqueducts and vast reservoirs. But in this arid environment, delivering water was only half the battle, preserving it was the other. The fierce, dry Saharan winds could cause devastating evaporation, stealing precious water before it ever reached a citizen's cup or a farmer's field. Roman engineers addressed this with brilliant practicality. Reservoirs and large public cisterns were often strategically positioned in topographical depressions or sheltered on their windward sides by natural rock formations or specially constructed berms. Aqueduct channels themselves were frequently covered with stone slabs, a feature often attributed solely to hygiene, but one that also served the vital function of creating a sealed, shaded environment that drastically reduced losses from both evaporation and wind-blown contamination. This combination of shielding and covering ensured that every possible drop of water was conserved, making sustained life in these outposts possible. Within the city itself, Roman architecture evolved to provide respite from the harsh climate. The famous Roman colonnade, a hallmark of their public spaces, took on a new functional layer in these African towns. While these covered walkways provided shade from the sun, their alignment also created sheltered, pleasant microclimates for social and commercial life. By positioning rows of columns perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction, architects could break the force of strong, dust-laden gusts while still allowing a gentle, filtered breeze to circulate, keeping the air moving and comfortable. Furthermore, the ruins of wealthier homes and public baths reveal the use of clever passive cooling techniques. Internal courtyards often featured small pools or fountains. As the wind entered the atrium, it would pass over this water, picking up moisture and providing a cooling effect through evaporation, an ancient form of swamp cooling that refreshed the interior rooms. Smaller windows on the windward side and cleverly arranged interior spaces helped to manage airflow and dust infiltration without sacrificing light or security. What is perhaps most remarkable about all these innovations is their invisibility in the historical record. The Romans were meticulous documenters, yet you won't find a scroll titled, "On the Alignment of Cities with the Wind." These adaptations were never celebrated as groundbreaking inventions. Instead, they were simply absorbed into the standard toolkit of Roman engineering, considered plain good practice rather than a specialized response to an environmental force. They blended so seamlessly into the overarching Roman principles of order, hygiene, public health, and civic comfort that their specific inspiration became lost. The Roman genius lay in this pragmatic flexibility, their ability to encounter a local challenge, devise a brilliantly effective solution, and then incorporate that solution so completely into their standard practice that it appeared to have been there all along. In the wind-swept outposts of North Africa, they proved that even the most rigid empire could learn to bend, building a legacy not just of conquest, but of quiet, intelligent coexistence with the elements. Leaving the grand stone cities of empires behind, we now follow the paths of the merchants and adventurers who connected them, venturing onto the most famous network of trade in human history, the Silk Road. This was not a single paved highway, but a sprawling web of routes stretching from the heart of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. And while we often picture hardy camels and determined travelers, there was another invisible caravan master setting the pace and charting the course, the desert wind. The successful movement of goods and people across thousands of miles of barren, hostile terrain was a delicate dance with these atmospheric forces, a dance where misreading the partner could be fatal. The timing of every caravan was a decision made not by a calendar alone, but by listening to the seasonal whispers of the wind, crossing the Taklamakan Desert, whose very name translates to place of no return, or the Kizilkum Desert, required impeccable timing. The brutal, scorching heat of summer made travel during those months a suicidal endeavor. Instead, merchants planned their arduous journeys for the winter months. But this wasn't just to avoid the sun, it was to harness a specific wind pattern. The winter months brought a shift in prevailing winds, often from a more favorable direction. These colder and sometimes moister winds made the physical exertion of travel more bearable for both humans and animals. More importantly, the winter air was often more stable, with a lower likelihood of the sudden, catastrophic sandstorms that could arise without warning in the turbulent summer heat. A merchant's entire fortune and his life depended on reading these seasonal cues correctly. They were amateur meteorologists, their knowledge passed down through generations, understanding that the wind didn't just blow, it spoke a language of safety and danger. This reliance on the wind fundamentally shaped the human geography of the entire region. The legendary oasis cities that dot the Silk Road, names that echo with romance and mystery like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, did not spring up by random chance. Their locations were meticulously selected based on a combination of water availability and, crucially, natural protection from the wind. These towns were often nestled in the lee of mountain ranges or tucked into sheltered valleys that acted as giant windbreaks. The geography provided a refuge from the worst of the dust storms and relentless gales that swept across the open steppe. A traveler arriving at Samarkand after weeks in the desert wouldn't just find water and food, they would find respite from the constant, battering force of the wind. This protection was what allowed these spots to grow from simple watering holes into thriving centers of commerce, culture, and innovation. They became the nerve centers of the Silk Road precisely because they offered a safe haven from the very element that governed travel between them. And it was within these wind-sheltered oases that the true magic of the Silk Road occurred. It wasn't just silks and spices changing hands. It was the blueprints for civilization itself. As merchants from Persia, India, China, and Rome mingled in the caravanserais and bazaars, they exchanged more than goods, they compared notes on survival. A builder from Mesopotamia might describe the wind-catching badgers of his homeland to an architect from the Tarim Basin. A trader from Egypt might explain how the alignment of a city's streets could keep them clear of sand. These conversations, happening over countless cups of tea, led to a silent, cross-cultural pollination of architectural wisdom. The knowledge of how to build with thick, insulating walls, how to orient a building to minimize dust infiltration, or how to design a roof to withstand powerful gusts began to spread. These techniques weren't carried in official scrolls or by royal decrees. They were carried on the wind and then discussed and adapted in the markets of oasis towns. A building technique developed in Persia to combat the Shamal wind might find itself being experimented with in a Central Asian kingdom a century later, slightly modified for local conditions. This was innovation through shared necessity, a collaborative response to a common environmental challenge that transcended language and culture. The wind, therefore, was far more than just a natural obstacle to be endured. It was the ultimate facilitator of global connection. By dictating the safest routes and the most favorable times to travel, it created a predictable, if challenging, rhythm for transcontinental exchange. The protection offered by strategically located cities allowed that exchange to deepen from simple barter into profound cultural synthesis, and the constant environmental pressure it exerted inspired a flow of technological ideas that helped diverse societies from Beijing to Baghdad build more resilient and comfortable lives. The Silk Road stands as a monument to human ambition and connection, but its very existence was choreographed by the silent, relentless, and invisible guides of the desert wind. This silent conversation with the wind is perhaps most beautifully expressed not in grand imperial decrees, but in the very stuff of daily life, the humble materials and construction techniques chosen by anonymous builders across the desert world. Without the benefit of modern engineering manuals or climate data, these master craftsmen developed an intuitive material science, selecting and shaping their resources based on one paramount criterion: resilience against the relentless, abrasive breath of the desert. Their choices, refined over millennia through simple trial and error, created a global architectural language spoken in wind-resistant forms, a whisper of practical wisdom encoded in walls and windows. Consider the most fundamental choice: what to build with. In forested regions, wood was plentiful, but in the desert, it was a rare luxury. More importantly, wood is vulnerable. It splinters, it warps, and it offers little defense against a sandstorm that can strip paint from steel. Instead, builders turned to the earth itself. Adobe, a simple mixture of mud, straw, and water, baked hard in the sun, became the material of choice from the American Southwest to the heart of Africa. Its genius lies in its properties. Thick adobe walls possess tremendous thermal mass, absorbing the heat of the day and slowly releasing it during the cool night, but they also act as a formidable barrier against wind. The rough, porous surface of dried mud actually helps to dissipate the energy of the wind, causing it to lose velocity as it scrapes across the wall face. In stonier regions like the deserts of Jordan or Persia, masonry took precedence, but even here the selection was careful. Builders often chose softer, more workable stones that could be laid with very tight, mortar-less joints, creating a solid, monolithic wall that presented no seams for the wind to exploit and pry apart. The weight and density of stone provided a passive resistance that simply could not be moved by even the most powerful gale. This was not an aesthetic preference for earthy tones. It was a survival strategy written in mud and stone. The architectural techniques that emerged are a masterclass in passive environmental defense. Walk through any ancient desert town, and you'll immediately notice the windows, or rather, the lack of them. Openings are small, narrow, and often recessed deeply into the thick walls. This design serves a dual purpose. Obviously, it minimizes the surface area exposed to the sun, keeping interiors cool. But crucially, it also reduces the number of vulnerabilities in the building's envelope. A large window is a weak point, a place where wind pressure can build up and where driven sand can easily infiltrate. A small, deeply set window acts as a natural baffle, forcing the wind to slow down and change direction dramatically before any particles can enter the living space. Then there's the shape of the buildings themselves. Sharp, 90-degree corners are a rarity in traditional desert architecture. Instead, you see rounded corners and curved walls everywhere. This isn't just a stylistic whimsy, it's sophisticated aerodynamics. A sharp corner creates turbulence, causing the wind to eddy and swirl, which increases local pressure and accelerates erosion on that specific point. A rounded corner, however, allows the wind to flow smoothly around the structure, like water flowing around a stone in a stream, drastically reducing erosion and structural stress. The wind literally glides off the building, unable to get a solid grip. For a breathtaking example of this wind-informed architecture pushed to its absolute extreme, one need look no further than the ancient city of Shibam in Yemen, often called the Manhattan of the desert. Rising abruptly from the floor of the Wadi Hadramaut, Shibam is a dense cluster of tower houses, some soaring over 100 feet high, all constructed from sun-dried mud brick. At first glance, building so high with such a seemingly fragile material in a region known for fierce winds seems like madness, but the urban form is a direct response to the environmental pressures. The city is incredibly compact, with the towers standing shoulder to shoulder. This creates a collective structural stability. Each building supports its neighbors, and together they present a solid, wind-breaking facade to the outside. The narrow, canyon-like streets between them are shielded from the worst of the wind, creating calm, shaded microclimates below. The towers themselves are tapered, being wider at the base and narrower at the top, lowering their center of gravity and helping them withstand lateral forces. The external surfaces are often covered with a smooth, hard plaster that must be continuously maintained. This smooth finish isn't just for looks. It prevents the wind from getting a purchase on any small imperfection and beginning the process of erosion. Every single aspect of Shibam's design, from its urban plan down to the texture of its walls, is a calculated defense against the wind, allowing a fragile material to achieve breathtaking heights and endure for centuries. What's truly fascinating is that this profound knowledge was rarely written down. It was transferred through the hands of apprentices learning from masters, a cultural inheritance embedded in the muscle memory of construction. A father would teach his son to mix the straw into the adobe in a specific way to prevent cracking from the dry wind, or to always orient the long axis of a new house parallel to the prevailing breeze. These practices became so deeply woven into the cultural fabric that their original, practical purpose was often forgotten, morphing over time into tradition, style, or even religious custom. The choice of material, the shape of a window, the curve of a wall, they stopped being seen as responses to an environmental force and simply became the way we build. This is the architectural whisper, a centuries-old dialogue with the wind that became so seamless, so intuitive, that it faded into the background of culture itself, hiding its brilliant engineering in plain sight as mere tradition. But to truly master the desert, one must solve its ultimate paradox, the management of water in a world dominated by wind. For ancient engineers, these two elements were not separate challenges. They were intimately linked in a delicate dance of survival. The relentless, dry winds that scoured their cities also held the secret to harvesting, preserving, and distributing the most precious resource of all. The greatest civilizations of the arid world understood this symbiotic relationship instinctively, developing ingenious systems where wind and water worked in concert to defy the desert's thirst. Consider the seemingly simple act of storing water. In a sun-baked environment, an open reservoir is a losing proposition. The same winds that provide cooling relief also accelerate evaporation, silently stealing away a community's lifeline. This fundamental physical reality dictated the very shape and depth of ancient water infrastructure. engineers from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley quickly learned that deep, narrow reservoirs were far superior to wide, shallow basins. A deep cistern presents a much smaller surface area relative to its volume to the drying effect of the wind. Furthermore, they often strategically placed these reservoirs on the leeward side of hills or buildings, using the landscape itself as a windbreak to create a pocket of still air over the water's surface, dramatically slowing the rate of evaporation. This wasn't just about building a container, it was about understanding the microclimates created by airflow and positioning vital resources within them. Even irrigation schedules were set by the wind. Farmers knew that watering crops on a calm morning would allow more water to seep down to the roots, while doing so on a windy afternoon would see much of it vanish into the dry air before it even hit the soil. The wind's rhythm set the tempo for agricultural life. This sophisticated understanding reached its absolute zenith in Persia, where the iconic wind tower, or badir, was put to work not just for human comfort, but as a guardian of water. While these magnificent structures are famous for cooling air, their role in preserving water supplies is a lesser-known marvel. Many Persian cities featured underground storage chambers for water and even perishable food, known as yakchuls. These chambers were often connected to the wind catcher system. As the wind was funneled down the tower and into the storage area, it performed a critical function. The moving air prevented stagnation, which was crucial for maintaining water quality and preventing the growth of algae and bacteria. But even more cleverly, the design could actually help cool the water itself. In some configurations, the incoming air would pass over a small channel of water or a saturated surface, causing evaporation that would drop the temperature of the remaining water in the storage pot through evaporative cooling. This meant the wind was actively working to keep water supplies both fresh and cool, a natural refrigeration system that required no energy beyond the desert breeze itself. It was a perfect marriage of elemental forces. Perhaps the most breathtaking illustration of this wind-water symbiosis comes from looking beyond the familiar deserts of the Middle East to the arid coasts of South America. The Inca Empire, facing extreme aridity along the Pacific coast, developed a stunningly simple technology, fog nets. In hillside communities where rain might not fall for years, but where thick, rolling fog banks regularly blew in from the ocean, Inca engineers erected large, vertical nets made of finely woven fabric or dense vegetation. As the wind drove the moisture-laden fog through these nets, tiny water droplets would coalesce on the fibers, grow heavier, and then drip down into collection channels below. This was direct harvesting of atmospheric moisture, a process entirely dependent on the wind's force to deliver the water. They were, in effect, farming the wind, transforming its movement into a tangible, life-giving resource. Similarly, in many desert cultures, the practice of dew collection was a wind-informed art. Clean, flat stones would be arranged in specific patterns that maximized their exposure to the night sky, which caused moisture from the air to condense on their cool surfaces. The morning wind, before it grew strong and warm, would then be counted on to help evaporate any residual impurities, leaving behind the collected dew relatively clean and ready to be gathered. This was a daily, delicate harvest that understood the wind's schedule intimately. This deep, intertwined relationship between wind and water management was the silent, unsung cornerstone of desert sustainability. It allowed empires to support populations that would otherwise be impossible, to grow crops in near-barren soil, and to establish permanent settlements in transient landscapes. Yet this genius is almost never explicitly credited to the wind in historical texts. A Persian scribe might praise the king for commissioning a new reservoir. An Inca chronicler might credit a local governor for installing fog nets. The wind, the invisible partner that made it all function efficiently, remained the unnamed architect, its contribution woven so seamlessly into the fabric of daily survival that it became indistinguishable from the act of engineering itself. They weren't just managing water, they were conducting an ancient, elemental orchestra where the wind was both the percussion and the rhythm. While we often marvel at the precise celestial alignments of ancient temples, orienting a structure to the stars was only part of the story. The very same civilizations that charted the heavens were also deeply attuned to the earthly flow of air, and this awareness quietly seeped into their most sacred spaces. The wind was not merely a physical phenomenon to be managed. It was a spiritual force, a breath of the gods, and its influence on religious architecture was both profoundly practical and deeply symbolic, a duality that has kept its true role hidden in plain sight for centuries. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure whose alignment to true north is legendary. While its astronomical precision is undeniable, its four smooth faces also present a specific, calculated geometry to the desert. The primary wind direction in this part of Egypt is from the north-northwest, and the pyramid's shape is remarkably effective at managing these persistent currents. The sloping sides force the wind to accelerate as it travels up and over the structure, rather than slamming directly into a flat vertical face. This aerodynamic design significantly reduces the wind's erosive power and prevents sand from accumulating in large drifts against its base. It's a brilliant piece of passive preservation, ensuring the monument's longevity. But for the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just engineering, it was a spiritual necessity. The pyramid was a vehicle for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the gods, and its enduring, unchanging form was crucial for his eternal journey. By designing a structure that could withstand the literal winds of time, the builders were ensuring its symbolic perfection and spiritual integrity for eternity. The wind's role was thus sanctified, its management a sacred duty to honor the divine. This fusion of the spiritual and the practical becomes even more striking when we journey across the world to the vast ceremonial complex of Teotihuacan in Mexico. The city's immense Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon are precisely aligned along the Avenue of the Dead, an alignment often discussed in relation to solar and lunar cycles. However, the placement of these structures also creates powerful wind channels. The avenue acts as a massive conduit, funneling the prevailing breezes that sweep down from the surrounding mountains directly through the heart of the religious precinct. This wasn't an accident. For the Teotihuacanos, wind was a sacred element associated with life, breath, and the spirit world. The movement of air through the ceremonial center would have been felt as a physical manifestation of divine presence, a constant, breathing energy animating the space. But the ingenuity goes even deeper. The steps of the pyramids, the wide plaza, and the parallel walls of the avenue were all acoustically tuned by this wind flow. The specific stone used and the angles of the structures create subtle sonic effects. A hand clap at the base of the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent can produce a distorted echo that resembles the chirp of the Quetzal bird, a sacred animal. These auditory phenomena, enhanced and carried by the channeled wind, would have profoundly intensified religious ceremonies, making the ethereal tangibly real for worshippers. The wind became the unseen priest, amplifying chants and transforming human sounds into something otherworldly. This concept of wind as a divine messenger or a conduit for prayer is a thread that connects disparate cultures. In Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions, the elements are sacred, and air represents the divine spirit of Vayu Vata. Their fire temples, while designed to protect the eternal flame from being extinguished, were also carefully ventilated to allow the sacred smoke to rise in a specific, ritualistic manner, a dance dictated by carefully placed openings that managed the wind's inflow. Similarly, in Islamic architecture, the design of many mosques incorporates courtyards and strategically placed windows to create cross-ventilation. This provides physical comfort for worshippers, but it also carries a deeper meaning. The movement of air symbolizes the movement of the spirit, the breath of life given by Allah, and the circulation of blessings within a sacred community. The practical need for fresh air was seamlessly blended with a spiritual metaphor, one so complete that its environmental origin faded from view. What makes this so fascinating, and why it has remained largely overlooked, is that this wind wisdom was never the primary stated purpose. The official reason for a pyramid's alignment was to connect with a star. The reason for a temple's orientation was to face a sacred mountain or the rising sun. The wind's influence was the silent partner, the practical solution that enabled the spiritual goal to endure. It was the means, not the end. This is why it doesn't feature prominently in myth or inscription. It was simply part of the master builder's toolkit, an implicit understanding that to honor the gods, one must first respect the elements they commanded. The wind shaped religious architecture not through decree but through necessity, a necessity so skillfully addressed that it became invisible, woven into the symbolic fabric of faith itself, allowing the whispers of the desert to echo in every prayer and ceremony. Yet for all the cultural and spiritual harmony these winds fostered, they also played a far more ruthless and decisive role in the pages of history, acting as a silent general in the rise and fall of empires through the art of war. Military campaigns, those colossal undertakings of human ambition, were often at the mercy of these invisible atmospheric currents. A commander's genius wasn't just measured in troop formations and battle tactics, but in his ability to read the desert's breath and use it to his advantage. The success of an invasion, the outcome of a siege, even the very location of a fortress, all were silently dictated by the wind. Planning a military campaign through arid regions was a logistical nightmare, and the single greatest unpredictable variable was the sudden onset of a sandstorm. These weren't mere inconveniences. They were force of nature events that could halt an army in its tracks, scatter supply trains, and literally bury soldiers and equipment under dunes of abrasive sand. The knowledge of seasonal wind patterns was therefore a form of ancient military intelligence. Armies would time their marches to avoid the seasons when certain winds were most violent. A general pushing into Mesopotamia would know to avoid the peak of the Shamal winds in the summer. An Egyptian pharaoh campaigning in the Levant would be wary of the Khamsin in the spring. This understanding was passed down through experience, often learned the hard way. The annals might record a great victory or a devastating defeat, but they rarely mention the sandstorm that delayed reinforcements for a critical week, or the favorable winds that allowed a force to move with unexpected speed, catching an enemy off guard. The wind was the unseen ally or the invisible enemy on every battlefield. This strategic awareness extended to the very design of defensive architecture. The placement of fortresses and castles was a science of environmental advantage. Look at the great Crusader castles like Kerak in Jordan, perched atop rugged hills and mesas. Their lofty positions are famously defensible, but their specific orientation on those peaks is equally telling. Builders consistently positioned the strongholds to use the natural topography as a windbreak. The living quarters, storerooms, and water cisterns would be nestled on the leeward side of the mountain, protected from the prevailing winds that could make life unbearable for the garrison, accelerate erosion on the walls, and contaminate water supplies with dust. A castle that could withstand a siege also had to withstand the environment, and a wind-sheltered position meant defenders could hold out longer, their morale and health better preserved than an attacking force camped on the exposed plains below, battered by the elements. The wind, in effect, was a permanent member of the garrison, an ever-present guardian that helped level the playing field for a vastly outnumbered defending force. For naval empires, this relationship with the wind was even more direct. It was the very fuel of their ambition. Consider the Phoenicians, the master mariners of the ancient Mediterranean. Their entire economy and influence were built upon their unparalleled skill at sea, and that skill was fundamentally based on a deep, intimate knowledge of seasonal wind patterns. They understood the predictable rhythms of the Mediterranean winds, when the breezes would blow favorably from the north to carry them south to Egypt, or when the patterns would shift to bring them back home laden with goods. This knowledge allowed them to plot reliable trade routes, establish colonies at strategic intervals, and create a maritime network that stretched from the Levant to the Strait of Gibraltar. Their voyages were not a matter of bravely sailing into the unknown. They were calculated journeys guided by an understanding of the sky's currents. This command of the wind gave them a monopoly on long-distance sea trade for centuries, granting them wealth and influence that far exceeded their small territorial size. The wind was their empire's engine, and their ability to harness it was a military and economic secret more valuable than any weapon. Perhaps the most cunning use of wind knowledge was in the art of siege warfare. There are accounts, though often shrouded in legend, of armies leveraging wind direction to gain a tactical upper hand. The most common application was the use of smoke. A besieging force might light fires on the windward side of a city or fortress, hoping the wind would carry the thick, choking smoke over the walls, hampering visibility and breathing for the defenders and making their resistance that much more difficult. More strategically, understanding the prevailing wind was crucial for preventing the spread of fire within one's own camp, a constant danger when thousands of cooking fires were lit in a dry, windy environment. A careless camp layout could see a single spark turn into a catastrophic blaze, wiping out supplies and morale in minutes. The wise general would always ensure his supply dumps and horse lines were placed upwind of the main campfires. This unspoken tactical doctrine, this environmental mindfulness, was as vital to a campaign's success as any sword or shield, a silent advantage that determined the fate of empires without ever earning a mention in the songs of victory. But the influence of these invisible currents extended far beyond the movement of goods and armies. They acted as the ultimate conduits for the very blueprint of civilization, carrying ideas and innovations across continents with the same relentless force they applied to the dunes. This cultural diffusion, powered by the wind, created a hidden unity in the built environment of empires that never formally communicated, weaving a common thread of environmental wisdom through disparate cultures. The most striking example of this is the journey of the wind tower, or badger, from its Persian origins to becoming a hallmark of architecture across the Middle East and North Africa. This ingenious invention, born from the necessity to cool buildings in the scorching Iranian plateau, didn't spread through conquest or imperial decree. Instead, it traveled on the very trade routes that the wind itself dictated. A merchant from Shiraz resting in a caravanserai in Baghdad might describe the comfort of his home, cooled by a tall, capting tower that scooped the breeze from high above. A traveling architect from Cairo, suffering through the stifling heat, would listen intently, absorbing the concept. Years later, back in Egypt, he might experiment with the idea, adapting the design for the local Khamsin winds and the available materials. Over centuries, this process of observation, discussion, and adaptation led to the badger appearing in the coastal cities of the Arabian Gulf, the ancient towns of Yemen, and across North Africa, where it became known as the Malkaf. Each culture adapted it, making it their own, yet the core principle remained, a testament to an idea carried on the wind and shared in wind-sheltered oases. This exchange of knowledge wasn't limited to grand architectural concepts. It included the intimate, practical wisdom of daily survival. Consider the Bedouin tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, masters of navigation in a sea of sand with no landmarks. Their survival depended on an encyclopedic knowledge of the stars, but this celestial map was intrinsically linked to the wind. They named specific stars and constellations based on the seasonal winds they heralded. The rising of a particular star might signal the arrival of the cool, northwesterly Shamal, indicating a safe time for a long journey. Another might warn of the hot, southerly winds that brought dust storms and danger. This complex system of wind-based navigation was a form of intellectual property, a survival technology honed over millennia. As Bedouin guides led trade caravans across the desert, this knowledge wasn't kept secret. It was shared, traded, and absorbed by the merchants and travelers who depended on it. A Greek trader from Alexandria or a Nabatean spice merchant would learn to read the sky not just as a map, but as a weather forecast, their understanding of the wind deeply enriched by this cross-cultural exchange. This shared language of the sky and wind became a universal currency on the trade routes, a non-verbal form of communication that facilitated not just travel, but the transfer of a profound environmental intelligence. Even our spoken languages bear the subtle fingerprints of this wind-driven exchange. The very words we use for wind tell a story of cultural movement and shared experience. The term sirocco, for the hot, humid wind blowing from North Africa towards southern Europe, is an Italian word derived from the Arabic sharq, meaning east. This linguistic journey mirrors the wind's own path, moving from one culture's vocabulary to another's. Similarly, the word monsoon, which defines the seasonal rains critical to societies from India to Arabia, comes from the Arabic mawsim, meaning season. These terms entered the lexicons of traders and sailors, becoming essential for communication and coordination across linguistic barriers. You can imagine a diverse crew on a dhow in the Indian Ocean, composed of Arabs, Indians, and Persians, using these borrowed wind words to discuss navigation and timing. This shared vocabulary, born from a shared experience of the elements, smoothed the process of cultural exchange, allowing for more precise communication about building techniques, agricultural schedules, and travel plans. The wind, in giving its name to different peoples, helped them find a common tongue. This unnoticed, wind-facilitated exchange is what created a surprising coherence in architectural traditions across vast distances. A traveler moving from the adobe pueblos of the American Southwest to the Qanats of Morocco might feel a strange sense of familiarity. Both feature thick, earth-built walls, small windows, and flat roofs, design choices that respond to similar challenges of heat and wind-borne sand. While these cultures had no contact, they were all responding to the same silent architect, arriving at parallel solutions through empirical adaptation. However, in the connected world of Africa and Asia, the wind actively helped blend these styles. The compact, wind-defying urban planning of a North African Medina shares a functional philosophy with the narrow, shaded streets of an ancient Syrian souk. This wasn't coincidence. It was the result of centuries of wind-guided trade that allowed builders to see how others solved common problems. The result was a unified architectural language for desert living, a set of design principles that transcended political borders and religious differences. It was a testament to a collaboration not between empires but between builders and the environment, with the wind serving as the faithful messenger that delivered the plans. Yet for all their brilliance in harnessing the wind, even the most powerful empires remained ultimately vulnerable to its most profound and unpredictable shifts. The stable climate patterns that allowed civilizations to put down roots and flourish were not a permanent guarantee. When those patterns changed, when the familiar winds faltered or grew destructive, the very foundations of society could crumble, often with its leaders and people completely unaware of the true environmental cause of their downfall. The story of empire is not just one of human triumph over nature, but also of nature's silent, inexorable reclamation. Consider the Akkadian Empire, history's first true empire, which stretched across Mesopotamia around 4,300 years ago. Under Sargon the Great, it unified a vast region through military might and sophisticated administration. Its agricultural heartland was fed by reliable irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, a system that functioned under a predictable climatic regime. Then, evidence from deep sea cores and ancient sediment layers tells us something catastrophic happened. A prolonged and severe drought descended upon the region, lasting for centuries. This wasn't just a lack of rain, it was a fundamental shift in the atmospheric circulation patterns. The prevailing winds that once carried moisture into the region changed their course or weakened significantly. The Shamal winds, already dry, may have become even more intense, scouring the topsoil from fields that could no longer be irrigated by dwindling rivers. The result was agricultural collapse on an unimaginable scale. Famine tore at the social fabric, triggering mass migrations from the north into the struggling southern cities. The central government, unable to feed its people or its army, lost all authority. Within a mere 100 years, the glittering Akkadian Empire had fractured into dust-blown ruins. To the Akkadians themselves, this catastrophe could only be understood through a spiritual lens. They left behind texts describing a divine curse, a punishment from the gods for some unknown sin. The idea that the very air around them had fundamentally changed, that the winds themselves had turned against them, was a concept entirely beyond their comprehension. They blamed their rulers, they blamed their gods, but they never knew to blame the climate. A similar story of climatic misunderstanding unfolded over 12,000 miles away in the lush rainforests of the Maya civilization. The classic Maya collapse between the 8th and 9th centuries AD is one of history's great mysteries, an event that saw mighty city-states like Tikal and Palenque abandoned to the jungle. While the causes were complex, a crucial piece of the puzzle appears to be a series of devastating droughts. But how does a society in a rainforest succumb to drought? The answer, once again, involves a tragic interplay between human activity and the wind. The Maya practiced extensive deforestation, clearing vast tracts of jungle for agriculture and using enormous quantities of wood for lime plaster to build their magnificent temples and pyramids. This widespread removal of vegetation had a dramatic effect on the local climate. Forests are crucial for the hydrological cycle. They release moisture into the atmosphere, which helps to form rain clouds. By cutting them down, the Maya inadvertently reduced the very rainfall they depended upon. Furthermore, without the deep roots of trees to hold it in place, the fertile topsoil became vulnerable to erosion. The seasonal winds, which had once been gentle carriers of moisture, now became agents of destruction, whipping across the exposed land and carrying away the precious soil needed to grow food. This created a vicious feedback loop. Less forest led to less rain and more erosion, which led to crop failure and social unrest, which perhaps led to even more desperate deforestation. The Maya priests, scanning the skies for omens and making offerings to the rain god Chok, were witnessing an ecological disaster they had helped create, yet they interpreted it through a framework of divine displeasure. The shifting wind patterns and failing rains were not seen as a consequence of their own environmental management, but as a sign that their rituals had failed and the gods had abandoned them. This fundamental misdiagnosis prevented any effective response, accelerating their descent into collapse. This pattern of misattribution is one of the most poignant themes in the history of collapse. Lacking our modern understanding of climatology and environmental science, ancient societies had no framework for explaining sudden, widespread crop failure or the disappearance of familiar weather patterns. The only logical explanations available to them were theological or political. A prolonged drought was inevitably seen as the wrath of an angry deity, requiring ever more desperate and often violent attempts at appeasement, from grander sacrifices to the construction of more temples. Alternatively, blame fell on the ruling class. A king or emperor who could no longer ensure prosperity was seen as having lost the mandate of heaven or divine favor, leading to civil unrest, rebellion, and the overthrow of dynasties. In reality, these leaders were often just as much victims of the changing climate as their poorest subjects, presiding over a collapse triggered by invisible shifts in global wind and weather systems that they had no way to measure, predict, or control. The true architect of their demise was not a flawed emperor or a neglected god, but the silent, shifting breath of the planet itself, a force that operated on a scale so vast it remained hidden behind the veil of human drama and divine myth. For centuries, the true story of how ancient civilizations interacted with the wind remained locked away, hidden in the silent stones of ruins and the forgotten patterns of the desert. We interpreted their choices as artistic, spiritual, or simply pragmatic, but we lacked the tools to see the invisible hand of the atmosphere guiding their every move. Today, that is all changing in a thrilling convergence of science and history. A new breed of explorer is entering the field, armed not just with trowels and brushes, but with satellite arrays, sophisticated climate models, and handheld anemometers. This powerful fusion of modern archaeology and meteorology is finally allowing us to decode the environmental wisdom of the past, and what we're discovering is forcing us to rewrite entire chapters of human history. The revolution begins not in the dirt but in the digital realm. Scientists are now feeding vast amounts of paleoclimatic data, evidence from ice cores, lake sediments, and geological strata into powerful supercomputers. These machines can run complex simulations, recreating the wind patterns, rainfall levels, and temperatures of the ancient world with astonishing accuracy. Suddenly, we can visualize the climate landscape that a Mesopotamian farmer or a Nabatean trader would have experienced. When researchers overlay these climate models with satellite imagery of known archaeological sites, startling correlations emerge. We can now see that the great cities of the Silk Road didn't just pop up near water. They were meticulously placed along corridors that historically experienced predictable, manageable wind patterns, avoiding zones where models show frequent, catastrophic dust storms. It's as if we've been given an ancient meteorological map that the builders themselves used, one that was so intuitive to them it never needed to be drawn. On the ground, archaeologists are now conducting their digs with a new set of questions and tools. It's no longer enough to simply map a wall. They now study its orientation with a precision compass and measure air flow across it with digital anemometers. They take samples from ancient drainage channels not just to look for artifacts, but to analyze the composition of the silt. By studying the layers of dust deposition, they can determine the prevailing wind direction over centuries, which side of a building was constantly scoured by the wind, and which side was protected and accumulated debris. This kind of analysis can reveal, for example, whether a mysterious, windowless wall was built for defense or specifically as a windbreak against a particular seasonal gale. They are looking for the subtle fingerprints of the wind everywhere, in the wear patterns on stones, the design of ventilation shafts, and the layout of entire city grids, treating the archaeological record as a vast, open-air laboratory of ancient environmental engineering. Perhaps no discovery better illustrates the power of this new approach than the ongoing reassessment of the Garamontes civilization in the heart of the Libyan Sahara. For a long time, classical Roman sources dismissed them as primitive nomadic raiders, mere troublemakers on the edge of the empire. But recent interdisciplinary studies have completely overturned this view, revealing them as a sophisticated and ingenious desert power. The Garamontes didn't just survive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They thrived, building a network of fortified towns and cultivating a vast agricultural hinterland. Their secret was an extensive and complex underground irrigation system, similar to the Persian Qanats called Fagara. But the question remained, how did they manage the immense maintenance of these tunnels in such an arid, windy climate? The answer came from combining archaeological excavation with environmental science. Researchers realized that the placement and design of the access shafts for these Fagara were perfectly aligned to harness the Sahara's relentless wind. The shafts acted as a natural ventilation system, using the pressure differences created by the wind flowing over the desert surface to draw stale air out of the tunnels and pull fresh air in. This passive airflow was absolutely critical. It prevented the tunnels from becoming dangerously low on oxygen for maintenance workers, and it inhibited the growth of molds and bacteria that could contaminate their precious water supply. The Garamontes were master hydrologists and master aerodynamicists, using the wind itself as a tool to maintain the system that gave them life. This is the profound shift happening in our understanding. We are moving from seeing ancient peoples as victims of their climate to recognizing them as brilliant, adaptive engineers who listened to and learned from their environment. The Garamontes weren't an oddity, they were the rule. This interdisciplinary approach is peeling back the layers of time to show us that what we once called coincidence, a city's alignment, a temple's orientation, a tower's shape, was actually deliberate, calculated adaptation. We are finally learning to read the language of the wind in the ruins it helped shape, and in doing so, we are recovering a vast body of lost knowledge about how to live sustainably with some of the most powerful forces on our planet. The history books are indeed being rewritten, not with new dates or kings, but with an entirely new character taking center stage, the invisible, ever-present, and endlessly creative force of the desert wind. Deep within the Algerian Sahara, a stark and breathtaking sight rises from the arid plains, the ancient city of Ghardaia, a cluster of pyramid-like homes painted in hues of ochre, blue, and white, stacked together in a seemingly chaotic yet perfectly harmonious mound. From a distance, it looks like a natural extension of the desert itself, but this is no accident of urban sprawl. It is a masterclass in environmental engineering, a living testament to a people who learned to build with the wind, not against it. The Mozabite people who constructed these cities 1,000 years ago possessed an intuitive genius that modern architects are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Their entire urban form is a direct, conscious dialogue with the desert's most powerful force. The most striking feature of Ghardaia's layout is its concentric circular design. Unlike the rigid grid of a Roman city or the sprawling plan of a modern metropolis, the city spirals inward, with buildings huddled closely together, their outer walls forming a continuous, curved barrier against the outside elements. This was a deliberate defensive strategy, but not against human invaders. This was a fortress designed to withstand the siege of the desert wind. The smooth, rounded contours of the outer buildings present no sharp corners for the wind to grip onto. Instead of slamming into a flat wall and creating turbulent, destructive eddies, the prevailing winds are forced to glide up and over the entire structure, their energy dissipated and their load of abrasive sand carried harmlessly over the rooftops. The city itself becomes a single, massive windbreak, sheltering the intricate network of streets and alleyways nestled within its heart. This design creates a profound stillness in the city's core, a sanctuary of calm air where the relentless howl of the desert is reduced to a distant whisper. Venturing into these sheltered inner streets reveals the next layer of this environmental wisdom. The alleys are narrow, deeply shaded, and intentionally labyrinthine. This isn't just a medieval aesthetic, it's a sophisticated climate control system. The high walls and narrow passages create what is known as an urban canyon. The sun's rays have great difficulty penetrating to the street level, keeping the ground remarkably cool even at the peak of the day. But the real magic happens with the air itself. The temperature difference between the sun-baked rooftops and the cool, shaded ground creates a constant convection current. Hot air rises from the roofs, and this draws the cooler air from the deep streets upward, creating a gentle but persistent breeze that ventilates the entire city without ever letting in the harsh, dusty wind from the open desert. The Mozabites were effectively using the sun's heat to power a passive, non-mechanical air circulation system, all through the brilliant design of their urban landscape. Individual buildings continue this conversation with the elements. While the Persian Badger is a towering structure, Mozabite architecture often features a more integrated approach. Small, strategically placed ventilation towers and cleverly oriented windows capture the slightest high-altitude breezes, funneling them down into the living spaces below. The buildings are constructed with incredibly thick walls made of limestone and gypsum, materials with high thermal mass that absorb the daytime heat and slowly release it during the cool nights, maintaining a stable and comfortable interior temperature with no need for external energy. Every single element, from the white lime wash used on the roofs to reflect sunlight, to the internal courtyard gardens that provide evaporative cooling, is a component in a comprehensive system designed for survival and comfort in one of the most extreme climates on Earth. This was not the work of a single architect but the culmination of centuries of accumulated, unspoken knowledge. The Mozabite builders did not have advanced degrees in fluid dynamics. They had generations of careful observation. They learned which building orientations accumulated the least sand, which alley designs remained the coolest, and which materials best withstood the scouring winds. This knowledge was so deeply embedded in their culture that it became tradition, its original practical purpose fading into the background, hiding its scientific brilliance behind the veil of daily life. The thriving communities that have existed in Ghardaia for a millennium are the ultimate proof of its success. They demonstrate that human habitation in the most hostile environments is not only possible but can be profoundly sustainable, achieved through a respectful and intelligent collaboration with the invisible forces of nature. The city doesn't fight the desert, it listens to it, and in doing so has become an enduring part of its very essence. This seamless blend of the practical and the symbolic reveals itself in one of the most iconic decorative elements of desert architecture, the lattice screen known as the mashrabiyah in the Islamic world. From the outside, these intricate wooden screens appear as beautiful, ornate panels, often featuring complex geometric patterns that catch the light and cast mesmerizing shadows. They are celebrated as high art, and rightly so, but their true genius is deeply functional. Each carefully carved opening is precisely sized to perform a delicate balancing act. The patterns are designed to allow the gentle flow of air to pass through, facilitating the crucial ventilation that cools interior rooms. At the same time, the latticework breaks the force of stronger gusts and, most importantly, acts as a superb filter for wind-blown sand and dust. The larger openings on the inside of the screen, tapering to smaller ones on the outside, further accelerate the incoming breeze through what is known as the venturi effect, providing a natural and refreshing airflow. The artisan carving the screen was not just creating a beautiful object, he was engineering a microclimate. The pattern chosen might be a star or a complex polygon, but its form was dictated by the need to manage the invisible force of the wind. This is where art and environment become indistinguishable. The aesthetic was the function, and the function gave rise to the aesthetic. It was a solution so elegant that its sheer practicality was hidden behind its beauty, allowing it to be appreciated for centuries as mere decoration. This principle of decorative functionality extends beyond screens and into the very surfaces of buildings. Look closely at the plasterwork on ancient structures from Morocco to India, and you'll often find recurring, flowing patterns, swirls, spirals, and undulating lines. While these might be interpreted as abstract art or floral motifs, they also subtly mimic the movement of air and water. These designs are not just visually pleasing, their textured, non-uniform surfaces help to disrupt laminar wind flow. When a steady, strong wind hits a perfectly flat wall, it can create vibrations and harmonics that, over time, can stress the masonry and produce a low, unsettling hum. The application of textured plaster in these specific patterns helps to break up that smooth flow, forcing the wind to become turbulent and dissipate its energy more gently across the surface. This reduces structural wear and eliminates the eerie noise, making the interior environment more peaceful. The builder applying this plaster was, in effect, painting a portrait of the wind itself, using its own chaotic language to tame its power. The result was a building that was not only more durable but also more serene, its walls silently performing their duty under the guise of pure ornamentation. Perhaps the most profound expression of this wind-informed artistry is found in the sacred spaces of the ancient world. The grand columns of Egyptian temples, for instance, were often designed to resemble bundles of papyrus reeds. While this harkens back to the primordial marsh of creation from which the Egyptians believed life emerged, it also serves a subtle aerodynamic purpose. The fluted, channeled surfaces of these columns are far more effective at managing wind flow than a smooth cylinder would be. As the wind moves around them, the channels help to minimize drag and reduce the potential for swirling vortices that could create noise or vibration within the sacred precinct. This allowed for a more controlled and quiet environment for meditation and ritual. The column was a symbol of stability and the natural world, but its form was also a perfectly adapted response to the physical world. The wind, a divine breath, was thus accommodated by the very symbols of the gods, creating a perfect circle of spiritual belief and environmental reality that has remained unbroken and largely unnoticed for thousands of years. But this sophisticated understanding of the wind's role in well-being was by no means confined to the Mediterranean. On the Indian subcontinent, an entire architectural philosophy emerged that wove the movement of air into its very foundational principles. Vastu Shastra, the ancient Indian science of architecture and design, places a profound emphasis on aligning structures with the natural forces of the universe, and the wind is a central character in this cosmic play. Vastu divides the compass into 8 primary directions, each governed by a specific deity and possessing unique energetic qualities. Among these, the cardinal directions are particularly crucial for harnessing the benefits of healthy airflow. The north and east are considered the sources of positive, gentle, and beneficial energies, and thus Vastu mandates that the main windows, doors, and ventilation openings of a home should primarily face these directions. This isn't merely a spiritual suggestion, it's a practical response to the Indian climate. The prevailing winds in much of India are from the southwest during the monsoon and from the northeast during the winter. By prioritizing openings to the north and east, Vastu-designed buildings naturally capture these cooler, cleaner breezes while often deflecting the hotter, dustier winds from the west. The internal layout of a traditional Vastu home is a masterclass in passive climate control. Central open courtyards act as thermal chimneys, drawing hot air upward and pulling cooler, fresh air through the surrounding rooms. Kitchen placement, the design of verandas, and even the slope of the roof are all calculated to maximize comfort and hygiene by working with, rather than against, the natural flow of air. This created living environments that were not only spiritually harmonious but also demonstrably healthier, reducing the stagnation of air that could lead to dampness, mold, and the spread of airborne illness. The wisdom of Vastu is a testament to a holistic view of health, one where physical comfort, mental peace, and environmental harmony were seen as inseparable, all orchestrated by the invisible but essential dance of the wind. This pursuit of health through wind-informed design found another magnificent expression in the social and architectural heart of Islamic cities, the hammam or public bathhouse. In an era before modern medicine, bathing was not just about cleanliness, it was a core tenet of health and wellness, a ritual of purification for both body and spirit. But operating a bathhouse in a hot, arid climate presented a significant engineering challenge: how to manage immense quantities of steam and humid air without creating a stifling, dangerous environment or allowing moisture to damage the structure. The solution was a brilliantly designed ventilation system that was entirely dependent on the wind. Hammams were often capped with distinctive domed roofs, but these were not solid. They were punctuated with small, strategically placed glass apertures. These openings were not random, they were carefully oriented to function as passive wind scoops. When the prevailing wind blew across the dome, it created a pressure difference that actively sucked the hot, stale, moisture-laden air up and out of the bath chamber below. This constant extraction prevented the air from becoming unbearably thick and oppressive, making the experience tolerable and even therapeutic. Simultaneously, fresh air was drawn into the complex through lower-level vents, often cleverly positioned in cooler, shaded areas to pre-cool the incoming breeze before it circulated through the various temperature-controlled rooms, the warm tepidarium, the hot coldarium, and the cool frigidarium. This created a continuous, gentle cycle of air renewal, ensuring bathers always had enough oxygen and that steam never reached debilitating levels. The master builders of the hammam understood the physics of convection and airflow with an intuitive precision, using the wind as a natural extraction fan to maintain the perfect balance of heat and humidity. This allowed these institutions to become thriving centers of community life, places where people could cleanse, heal, and socialize in a safe and comfortable environment, all thanks to an unseen, silent partnership with the breezes flowing over their city. What unites these disparate traditions, from the Hippocratic texts to the principles of Vastu and the engineering of hammams, is a universal, albeit unspoken, recognition that the quality of the air we breathe is fundamental to our health. Long before we understood germ theory or the science of epidemiology, ancient societies possessed an empirical understanding that stale, stagnant air was associated with disease and miasma, while fresh, moving air was invigorating and health-promoting. The wind was nature's ultimate sanitizer and ventilation system. This profound insight directly shaped the urban landscape. Cities were planned with wide, airy avenues not just for grandeur, but to allow the wind to flush out the odors and impurities of crowded urban life. Houses were designed with cross-ventilation as a primary concern, ensuring that no corner of a room was left without access to moving air. These were not mere architectural preferences, they were public health measures enacted on a civilizational scale. The cumulative effect of these countless individual adaptations was a significant impact on human longevity and quality of life. By unconsciously tailoring their existence to the rhythms of the wind, our ancestors created environments that reduced the prevalence of respiratory ailments, minimized the spread of contagions, and promoted overall well-being. This silent, enduring collaboration with the atmosphere is a powerful reminder that the greatest advancements in health are sometimes not found in a doctor's scalpel or a chemist's vial, but in the simple, timeless act of opening a window to the right breeze. While the grand empires of antiquity were building their wind-aligned cities and monuments, another, far older school of knowledge was already thriving in the very heart of the desert, a wisdom not written on papyrus or carved in stone, but carried in the oral traditions and lived experience of its indigenous peoples. Groups like the Tuareg of the Sahara, the Bedouin of Arabia, and the San of the Kalahari didn't just live in these harsh landscapes. They possessed an intimate, generational dialogue with them, a conversation in which the wind was a primary speaker. Their survival depended on an encyclopedic understanding of atmospheric nuances that imperial surveyors could scarcely perceive, and this deep, local knowledge became the silent, uncredited foundation upon which many desert empires built their success. For the Tuareg, often called the Blue People of the Sahara, the wind was a compass, a calendar, and a herald of danger. Their entire concept of navigation was a masterpiece of environmental interpretation. They didn't traverse the trackless sea of sand by following a set of mapped landmarks, because the dunes themselves were constantly reshaped by the wind. Instead, they read the sky. They knew that specific wind patterns were associated with the rising and setting of certain stars. The appearance of a particular constellation on the horizon might signal the imminent arrival of a specific seasonal wind, telling them it was time to break camp and move to a known oasis before the water holes dried up. They could feel subtle shifts in air pressure on their skin, sense a change in humidity, and even interpret the specific scent carried on a breeze, the faint smell of damp earth that might mean a distant rain shower, or the metallic tang that often preceded a violent sandstorm. This knowledge allowed them to predict weather days in advance, a skill that was nothing short of magical to outsiders. They understood that the wind didn't just blow randomly. It had a grammar, a syntax of patterns that could be learned and anticipated. This profound expertise did not remain isolated in tribal circles. It inevitably flowed into the burgeoning networks of trade and empire. When a Roman legionary, a Nabatean spice merchant, or a Garamantian envoy needed to cross a vast, unknown desert, they didn't do it alone. They hired Tuareg or Bedouin guides. These indigenous navigators were the original desert pilots, their services absolutely essential for any large-scale movement of people or goods. On these long, arduous journeys, knowledge was exchanged around the campfire. A Roman engineer might explain the principles of aqueduct construction, while his Tuareg guide would point to the sky, explaining how the behavior of the high cirrus clouds, swept into particular shapes by the jet stream, could forecast the weather for the next week. The empire builders absorbed this knowledge voraciously, but they often stripped it from its original context. The complex, holistic understanding of the Tuareg, woven into their language and cosmology, was reduced into practical, actionable data points for imperial logistics. Travel northwest when this star rises. Avoid this valley when the wind smells like this. This process created a profound and largely unacknowledged collaboration. The magnificent, resilient infrastructures we've explored, the Qanat systems, the wind-aligned cities, the sheltered trade routes, were very often built upon a bedrock of indigenous wisdom. Imperial engineers provided the scale, the labor, and the organizational might, but the initial intelligence, the crucial understanding of where to build and how the environment would behave, frequently came from the local inhabitants who had mastered that environment over millennia. The Persian Empire's sophisticated Qanat network, for instance, almost certainly benefited from pre-existing local knowledge of underground water sources, knowledge that nomadic tribes would have possessed from centuries of digging simple, shallow wells at desert stopping points. The Romans, masters of assimilation, were particularly adept at this. They would enter a new territory, observe the local practices for water management and settlement placement, and then apply their own engineering genius to scale those practices into monumental imperial projects. The original innovators received no credit in the historical record. Their contribution was simply absorbed into the narrative of Roman ingenuity. The result of this silent partnership was a unique and powerful form of hybrid resilience. The empires gained stability and longevity by building in harmony with the environment, guided by a wisdom they never formally acknowledged. The indigenous knowledge, in turn, found a new kind of permanence and wider application, its principles etched into the stone of cities and the routes of global trade networks that would endure long after the empires themselves had faded. It was a collaboration born not of equality but of necessity, a meeting of imperial ambition and ancient, localized wisdom, with the desert wind whispering the same secrets to both, forever shaping the course of human history from the shadows. Perhaps the most iconic and enduring symbol of our partnership with the wind is the ancient Persian windmill, a revolutionary invention that emerged from the arid plains of eastern Persia, likely around the 7th century. These were not the familiar, towering Dutch windmills of later centuries, but a far more ingenious and practical design perfectly adapted to its environment. Known as Painmoen windmills, they featured a vertical central shaft with a series of vertical sails made of reeds or cloth. The true brilliance of their design, however, lay in their enclosure. They were often built within mud brick structures that funneled the wind from any direction into a single, powerful current that would strike the sails and set the central axle spinning. This was technology born from absolute necessity. In the high, windy plateaus where these mills were constructed, water for turning traditional water wheels was scarce, and human or animal power was inefficient for the massive task of grinding grain for growing populations. The relentless wind, once a source of erosion and hardship, was suddenly transformed into a tireless, free labor force. The grain ground by these early mills didn't just feed local villages. It helped sustain the sprawling urban centers of the Persian Empire, boosting agricultural productivity to a level that could support a complex, stratified society with artisans, soldiers, and administrators who didn't have to farm to feed themselves. Even more critically, the same principle was adapted for the empire's lifeblood, water. Simpler, paddle-driven wind wheels were used to lift water from wells and channels for irrigation, turning barren plots into productive gardens. This was a monumental shift in human history, the first major harnessing of wind for mechanical energy, and it was a direct, empirical response to the persistent wind patterns that shaped the Persian landscape. The builders didn't set out to conquer nature, they simply learned to listen to its rhythm and put its constant energy to work. This mastery of the wind was not confined to the land, it was equally transformative on the open sea. While the Persians were building their grain mills, the Phoenicians, a maritime civilization based in the Levant, were undertaking their own wind-powered revolution. Their entire existence was tied to the Mediterranean Sea, and their prosperity depended on their ability to navigate it safely, quickly, and reliably. Their great innovation was not the sail itself, which had been used for millennia, but the sophisticated optimization of sail design and rigging to exploit the specific wind patterns of the Mediterranean basin. They developed a square sail that could be adjusted and angled to capture the wind more efficiently than fixed sails. More importantly, they possessed an intimate, granular knowledge of the Mediterranean's wind regimes. They understood the predictable seasonal shifts, like the steady Artesian winds that blew from the north during the summer, providing a perfect conveyor belt for southbound voyages to Egypt. They knew how to use the daily onshore and offshore breezes caused by the differential heating of land and sea to navigate coastal waters. This knowledge turned their ships into the most advanced vehicles of their age. A Phoenician merchant could set sail from Tyre with a cargo of prized purple dye and cedar wood, confident that the winds would carry him to his destination in Egypt or Carthage within a predictable time frame. This reliability supercharged their trade networks, allowing them to establish colonies across the Mediterranean and become the primary distributors of goods, ideas, and technologies between the empires of the East and the budding cultures of the West. The wind was the invisible engine of their commercial empire, and their ships were the perfectly crafted instruments that played its melody. What makes these parallel innovations so fascinating is the common thread of unspoken adaptation that connects them. The Persian windmill builder and the Phoenician shipwright were likely not theoretical physicists contemplating the laws of aerodynamics. They were practical problem solvers working within the constraints and opportunities presented by their environment. They observed over generations that the wind in a particular valley always blew from a certain direction with great force. They noticed that a square sail behaved differently than a rectangular one on a beam reach. Through endless experimentation and the slow, patient accumulation of tacit knowledge, they refined their designs, the perfect curvature of a sail, the optimal angle of a mill's sailcloth, the best wood for a mast that could withstand constant strain. These were all discoveries made at the workbench and on the waves, not in the library. The resulting technologies were so effective, so seamlessly integrated into the daily functioning of their societies, that their origin in a dialogue with the wind was quickly forgotten. They were simply seen as human inventions attributed to the genius of a culture. We celebrate the Phoenicians as master sailors and the Persians as ingenious engineers, which they undoubtedly were, but we often miss the silent partner in their achievements. Their genius lay in their humility, in their ability to observe the world around them with such clarity that they could discern the patterns of the wind and find a way to join its dance, transforming its wild energy into the grinding of grain, the pumping of water, and the filling of sails that built the world we know today. But perhaps the most fascinating layer of these ancient myths is how they often contain precise, actionable information disguised as narrative. Among the Native American tribes of the arid Southwest, stories about the wind were less about personified gods and more about direct instruction. The Hopi people tell of the wind god Yaponcha, who not only brought the breath of life but also taught them how to build. Their legends speak of Yaponcha's relentless nature, and within these tales are embedded crucial architectural principles. A story might describe how the wind god tested a village by trying to blow down their homes, and only those with rounded corners and low profiles survived. This wasn't just an exciting story for children. It was a coded manual for building wind-resistant structures, ensuring that each generation internalized the most effective design for their environment without needing a technical explanation. Similarly, the Navajo creation story describes the wind as the means by which life and thought entered the first beings. This profound spiritual concept was mirrored in their practical world through the design of the hogan, their traditional dwelling. The doorway of a hogan always faces east to greet the morning sun, but this alignment also captures the prevailing morning breeze, allowing for natural ventilation that clears the smoke from the central fire and replaces stale air with fresh. The myth provided the sacred reason, while the practice delivered the life-saving result, seamlessly blending the spiritual with the supremely practical in a way that ensured the knowledge would be preserved and respected. This pattern of encoding survival data in storytelling is a global phenomenon. In the deserts of Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories feature the ancestral spirit of the wind, who often travels along specific paths at certain times of the year. These narrative routes correspond almost exactly with the documented seasonal shifts of wind patterns that bring rain or signal the arrival of a hot, dry spell. For a people living in a landscape where knowing when to travel or when to seek shelter could mean the difference between life and death, these stories were a dynamic, living map. They transformed abstract meteorological patterns into memorable, character-driven journeys, making complex environmental knowledge accessible to everyone, from the youngest child to the eldest elder. The story itself became the most robust and disaster-proof data storage system, immune to the loss of a single scroll or the destruction of a temple, carried safely in the collective memory of the people. The great irony, and the reason this incredible engineering insight remained hidden for so long, is that the very success of this method became its veil. As these civilizations thrived, the original practical purpose of the myths faded into the background. The symbolic and religious significance took precedence, as is natural over centuries. We look back at the Egyptian god Shu holding up the sky goddess Nut, and we see a beautiful cosmological myth. We rarely stop to consider that the breath holding up the sky is also the same north wind that allowed Egyptian boats to sail against the Nile's current, the same wind that ventilated the temple of Karnak. The practical knowledge became so deeply woven into the fabric of culture and religion that it disappeared from view, perceived not as applied physics but as divine tradition. The builders who oriented a temple to the wind did so because it was how it was always done, because it was pleasing to the gods, not because they were consciously fighting sand accumulation. This disconnect meant that when modern archaeologists and historians began to interpret these ancient cultures, they focused on the obvious, the religious texts, the grand myths, the artistic symbolism. They saw the poetry and missed the practical manual hidden within it. The wind's role was right there in the stories, but we were listening for answers about the afterlife, when they were actually giving us instructions on how to build a better one here on Earth. Now let's pull the camera back for a truly global view. It's one thing to see how individual empires adapted to their local winds, but when you start comparing architectures from opposite sides of the planet, something astonishing emerges. A mysterious pattern of parallel invention appears, a series of architectural echoes that suggest a universal human conversation with the same invisible partner. From the sun-baked pueblos of the American Southwest to the towering wind catchers of the Iranian plateau, cultures that never exchanged a single word or drawing arrived at shockingly similar solutions to the same fundamental problems of heat, sand, and airflow. This isn't a story of cultural diffusion. It's a story of convergent environmental evolution, where the wind itself acted as the same demanding teacher to students worlds apart. Consider the iconic adobe pueblos of the Taos people in what is now New Mexico. These multi-storied communal dwellings, built from a mixture of earth, water, and straw, rise from the desert like natural formations. Their design is a masterclass in passive environmental control, achieved through principles that would feel instantly familiar to a Persian architect. The walls are incredibly thick, providing immense thermal mass to absorb the daytime heat and release it slowly during the cold desert nights. The windows are small and recessed, not just to reduce solar gain, but to minimize points of entry for the abrasive, dust-laden winds that sweep across the high desert. The entire structure is often oriented to present a solid, rounded facade to the prevailing winds, allowing the air to flow smoothly around it with minimal resistance and erosion. Now travel over 7,000 miles to the ancient city of Yazd in central Iran. Here, the skyline is dominated by the magnificent badgers or wind catchers towering above the rooftops. Yet, look at the buildings themselves. They are also constructed of thick, mud brick walls. They also feature small, deeply set windows. They are also clustered closely together to provide mutual shade and wind protection. The core architectural philosophy is identical. Use locally sourced, high-mass materials to create a robust barrier against the climate, and design openings with precise intention to manage the wind rather than simply welcome it. Two cultures completely isolated by geography and history, engaged in the same silent dialogue with their environment and arrived at the same profound conclusions. This phenomenon of parallel invention extends beyond just materials to the very shape of buildings. In the ancient Berber villages of Morocco's Atlas Mountains, you find structures with beautifully rounded corners and curved walls. This isn't merely an aesthetic choice, it's a sophisticated aerodynamic solution that prevents the wind from creating destructive vortices that accelerate erosion on sharp edges. Now cross the Atlantic to the island of Malta, where the earliest Neolithic temples like Haga Kim also feature massive, curved external walls. While their primary purpose was structural, this rounded design would have also been exceptionally effective at managing the fierce Mediterranean winds, allowing the storms to glide over the sacred spaces within. Even further afield, the traditional trullo houses of southern Italy's Puglia region, with their distinctive conical, dry stone roofs, present a shape that is remarkably efficient at shedding wind and rain. The same logic applies to the circular, thatched roof huts found in many parts of Africa. The circle presents no weak corner to the wind, distributing its force evenly around the structure. This recurring preference for rounded forms across continents and millennia points to a deep, intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics, a shared human genius for reading the land and the sky and responding in the most logical, resilient way possible. What makes this global pattern so compelling is the complete absence of any possibility of direct contact between these builders. A Hopi architect in Arizona had no way of knowing what a Nubian builder was doing along the Nile. This means these ideas weren't stolen or borrowed. They were independently discovered time and again because the environmental pressures were so similar and the logical solutions so clear. The relentless desert wind, in its constant scouring and drying, presented a universal set of problems: how to stay cool, how to stay warm, how to keep out dust, and how to make a structure stand for generations. And humanity, in its boundless creativity, kept arriving at a universal set of answers: build thick, build smart, orient with purpose, and shape your world in harmony with the invisible forces that shape it. This suggests that this environmental wisdom is not a cultural artifact, but a fundamental part of human ingenuity, a shared toolkit that emerges whenever survival depends on listening to the planet. Yet, for all this global commonality, the attribution of this genius remained intensely local. The Persian builder credited his badger to the wisdom of his ancestors and the favor of Allah. The Puebloan elder saw the design of her village as a sacred gift from the ancestral spirits, a way of life in balance with the natural world. The Egyptian priest thanked the god Shu for the cooling north wind that ventilated his temple. Each culture wrapped its environmental adaptations in a cloak of local mythology, religion, and tradition. They saw their solutions as a product of their unique cultural genius, a special insight granted to them by their gods or their specific history. In doing so, they completely missed the breathtakingly obvious pattern that everyone else living in a hot, windy desert was doing the exact same thing. This cultural framing, while beautiful and meaningful, effectively hid the true, universal architect behind their work. It prevented them from seeing that their achievements were part of a global human response to a planetary force. The wind was the common denominator, the invisible thread connecting the destiny of empires, a silent collaborator in the story of human civilization whose contributions were so seamless they were mistaken for local divine inspiration. This hidden connection reveals a story far grander than any single culture could tell. It is the story of humanity itself, learning to build a world in concert with the very air we breathe. Today, as we confront the immense challenges of a warming planet and soaring energy demands, we find ourselves turning back the clock, not in retreat but in rediscovery. The very same wind-adaptive wisdom that allowed ancient empires to thrive in harsh deserts is now experiencing a powerful renaissance, fueling a revolution in contemporary sustainable architecture. This isn't about mere historical curiosity. It's a vital, urgent search for proven solutions to modern problems. The passive cooling techniques perfected over millennia in places like Persia and North Africa are being re-engineered with modern materials and computational design, offering a breathtakingly elegant path to reducing our reliance on energy-intensive air conditioning. Imagine a new skyscraper in a scorching desert city like Dubai or Phoenix. Instead of being a glazed glass box that acts like a solar oven, requiring massive chillers to run constantly, its very form is its function. The building might be oriented on its site to maximize exposure to prevailing breezes, its facade shaped to accelerate wind flow across its surface, creating a cooling boundary layer. Inside, a central atrium acts as a thermal chimney, using the stack effect to draw hot air up and out, while pulling cooler air in from shaded courtyards below. This is the modern reinterpretation of the Persian wind tower and the Roman atrium, a system that provides comfort and fresh air without a single kilowatt of electricity for most of the year. Architects are now studying the precise angles of the mashrabiyah screens to design high-tech, 3D printed facades that provide shade, filter dust, and promote airflow with even greater efficiency, all while creating ever-shifting patterns of light and shadow that connect the building to its environment in a dynamic, living dance. This ancient knowledge is no longer a forgotten artifact. It's the cutting edge of green building design, a testament to the fact that the most advanced solutions are often those that have been tested by time itself. This revival of wind wisdom extends far beyond individual buildings to the very planning of our cities. The compact, labyrinthine layout of ancient Ghardaia, with its wind-sheltered streets and collective thermal mass, offers a powerful alternative to the sprawling, car-dependent suburban model that dominates in arid regions. Modern urban planners are now advocating for higher density, mixed-use developments where buildings provide mutual shade and wind protection, reducing the urban heat island effect. They are designing green corridors and water features not just for aesthetics, but to create cool air pathways that can channel refreshing breezes deep into the urban core, exactly as the narrow Sikh Canyon did for Petra. Understanding historical wind patterns is also crucial for climate resilience strategy. By analyzing paleoclimatic data, scientists can better predict how shifting wind regimes might affect water availability, dust storm frequency, and extreme heat events in the decades to come. This allows cities to proactively design infrastructure, from the placement of reservoirs and solar farms to the routing of transportation networks, to be more resilient to these changes. A city might choose to locate a new power plant on the leeward side of a natural windbreak to minimize dust contamination, or plan agricultural belts based on historical wind-driven pollination and rainfall patterns. This long-term ecological perspective, so innate to ancient builders, is what we desperately need to reintegrate into our modern, often short-sighted planning processes. The ultimate value of this forgotten knowledge lies in its profound simplicity and accessibility. In many parts of the world, the energy and financial costs of conventional air conditioning are prohibitive. The principles of ancient wind adaptive architecture, however, are often low-tech and affordable, relying on intelligent design rather than complex machinery. Communities can build with locally sourced, high-thermal mass materials like rammed earth or adobe, orient their homes to capture cooling breezes, and use vegetation for shade and evaporative cooling. This democratizes comfort, making sustainable living achievable without massive financial investment or sophisticated technology. It offers a blueprint for the sustainable urbanization of desert regions, which are expanding due to climate change and population growth. By looking to the past, we are not romanticizing a bygone era. We are unlocking a toolkit for a more resilient, equitable, and livable future. The silent architect that shaped the pyramids and the wind towers is still here, still whispering its secrets. Our task is simply to stop, listen, and finally learn how to build a world that works in harmony with the eternal breath of the planet. Of course, not every stone laid by ancient hands was placed with the wind in mind. As we've journeyed through these wind-swept empires, it's crucial to step back and acknowledge a necessary truth. The past is a complex tapestry, and if we pull too hard on a single thread, the whole picture can distort. The danger of any compelling theory is the temptation to see its evidence everywhere, to become a hammer seeing every historical mystery as a nail. The truth is, ancient builders were motivated by a symphony of factors: religious belief, astronomical observation, political power, simple topography, and yes, environmental adaptation. Our challenge is to listen for the wind's distinct melody within that symphony, not to mistake it for the entire orchestra. Take, for example, the world's most famous stone circle, Stonehenge. Its majestic, towering sarcens are precisely aligned to the summer and winter solstices, a breathtaking feat of celestial observation. The primary reason for its orientation is undeniably astronomical, a connection to the heavens and the cycles of the sun that held profound spiritual significance for its Neolithic builders. To claim its alignment was primarily about wind would be a clear case of over-attribution, ignoring the overwhelming evidence for its ritual and calendrical purpose. However, this doesn't mean the wind was entirely absent from the equation. If we zoom out from the monument itself and look at the broader landscape, at the traces of the temporary settlements that housed the people who built and used Stonehenge, we might find a different story. The placement of these seasonal camps, the layout of their simple dwellings, these might very well show considerations for shelter from the prevailing westerly winds that sweep across Salisbury Plain. The Grand Temple was for the gods and the cosmos, but the homes for its builders were for practical, earthly comfort. This is the nuanced view we must adopt, recognizing that different structures served different purposes and thus responded to different primary influences. This is where modern science becomes our most valuable tool for separating coincidence from causation. We can no longer rely on simple observation. We must subject these ideas to rigorous, data-driven analysis. By using advanced climatic modeling, we can reconstruct the precise wind patterns that would have prevailed at a specific archaeological site thousands of years ago. We can then create digital simulations to test how different architectural orientations would have interacted with those winds. Did a particular city's grid alignment actually reduce dust infiltration, or is that just a happy accident of its topographical placement? By feeding geological data, pollen records, and sediment analysis into these models, we can build an incredibly detailed picture of the ancient environment. This allows us to move beyond speculation and make evidence-based conclusions. we can identify cases where the wind adaptive benefits are too consistent and too effective to be mere chance, while also clearly identifying those instances where other factors were demonstrably paramount. This critical, discerning approach doesn't diminish the wind's role, it actually strengthens it by carefully distinguishing genuine wind wisdom from other influences. We protect this fascinating field from the kind of overreach that leads to it being dismissed as pseudoscience. It allows us to say with greater confidence that the ventilation system of the Persian wind tower was a deliberate and sophisticated invention, while also acknowledging that the alignment of a Mayan pyramid was almost certainly for astrological reasons. This honesty is what gives the theory its power. It transforms the narrative from a fun, what-if scenario into a credible, respected line of archaeological inquiry. It allows us to honor the genuine, brilliant adaptations of our ancestors without romanticizing them, giving credit to their multifaceted genius that could weave together the practical and the spiritual, the celestial and the terrestrial, into the enduring stone legacy we are only now learning to fully appreciate. Yet for all the incredible discoveries we've made, this field of research is really just beginning to open up, brimming with tantalizing unanswered questions that are drawing a new generation of scientists and historians into the fold. One of the most pressing mysteries lies in understanding the precise economic mechanisms that the wind governed. We know trade routes followed favorable winds, but to what exact degree did the consistency of these trade winds dictate the economic stability of an empire? Could a temporary shift in a monsoon pattern have triggered inflation in Rome due to a delay in Egyptian grain shipments? Might the legendary wealth of the Nabateans have experienced boom and bust cycles directly tied to multi-decade patterns in the wind currents that guided their caravans? These are questions that require a deep integration of economic history with paleoclimatology, a merging of ledger and anemometer that could radically reshape our understanding of ancient markets. The wind wasn't just a facilitator of trade. It may have been the invisible hand that set prices, determined salaries, and ultimately decided the fiscal fate of entire nations, a theory we are only now developing the tools to properly investigate. Beyond the grand economic theories, there is the thrilling prospect of pure physical discovery. For every well-known site like Petra or Giza, there are countless others still hidden beneath the desert sands, each holding the potential to rewrite our understanding. The vast and remote deserts of the Taklamakan and Gobi are particularly compelling frontiers. These regions were once crossroads of the world, dotted with thriving oasis cities along the Silk Road, but many were abandoned and subsequently buried by shifting dunes over the centuries. The very winds that doomed them to obscurity also served as their perfect preservator, sealing them in a dry, sterile time capsule. What unknown architectural adaptations might we find in these unexcavated ruins? Perhaps a city lay out even more sophisticated than Gardaia's, or a water capture technology that makes the Qanats system look elementary. Each new discovery has the potential to add another crucial piece to the puzzle, revealing how different cultures, from the Sogdians to the Tocharians, developed their own unique dialects in this universal language of wind-wise design. Unlocking these secrets, both economic and architectural, hinges on a new suite of technological tools that are pushing the boundaries of what we can know about the past. The most powerful of these is artificial intelligence. Researchers are now feeding AI algorithms a staggering array of data, high-resolution satellite imagery, detailed topographical maps, centuries of climatic records, and the entire corpus of archaeological findings from a given region. The AI's task is to find patterns and correlations that would be utterly invisible to the human eye. It might cross-reference the orientation of 100 forgotten settlements with a model of ancient wind patterns, and identify a previously unknown optimal alignment for avoiding dust storms. It could analyze the erosion patterns on 1,000 pottery shards to determine the predominant wind direction that sandblasted them over the ages. This isn't just number crunching, it's a form of digital divination, allowing us to ask the landscape itself questions we never thought possible and receive answers drawn from a deep well of interconnected data. This technological revolution extends from the digital cloud down to the very grains of sand. Portable LiDAR scanners can now map entire ruins in minutes, creating 3D models so precise we can run computational fluid dynamics simulations on them, watching how the wind would have flowed through streets and between buildings thousands of years ago. Chemical analysis techniques can now identify the specific isotopic signature of dust particles trapped in ancient mortar, telling us conclusively which direction the wind was blowing when the builders mixed their mud bricks. We are no longer just archaeologists or historians. We are becoming forensic detectives of the atmosphere, piecing together the crime scene of a forgotten storm or the perfect conditions that allowed a city to thrive. Each advancement pulls back the curtain a little further, revealing the depth of the conversation our ancestors held with the wind, a dialogue conducted not in words but in stone, brick, and the very layout of their lives. This is a field evolving at a breathtaking pace, inviting all of us to stay curious, because the next discovery might just be a single algorithm away from changing everything we thought we knew about the rise and fall of the ancient world. From the perfectly aligned stones of the pyramids to the ingenious wind-scooping towers of ancient Persia, we have traced the breadth of the desert across the canvas of human history, uncovering a story where the silent architect was not a king or an emperor, but the relentless shaping force of the wind itself. For millennia, these invisible currents have whispered secrets to builders and traders, guided the placement of cities and the routes of empires, and engineered marvels of sustainability that we are only now beginning to decode. This journey reveals a profound truth. Our greatest historical achievements were not a triumph over nature, but a brilliant, often unconscious collaboration with it. The wind was the unseen partner in innovation, a silent teacher of resilience, and the ultimate facilitator of the cultural exchanges that built our world. As we stand today facing unprecedented environmental challenges, from soaring global temperatures to critical water shortages, these ancient lessons in wind wisdom are no longer just historical curiosities. They are a vital, timeless blueprint for our future. The solutions we desperately seek for sustainable living in a warming world are not always found in untested, complex technology. Often, they are etched in the stone and sand of our past. The passive cooling principles of the wind tower, the urban planning that creates its own microclimates, the water management systems that work in concert with the air, these are proven strategies, refined over centuries, that can drastically reduce our energy consumption and enhance our resilience. This forgotten knowledge invites us to shift our perspective, to stop seeing nature as an obstacle to be conquered, and to start listening to it as a guide, just as the Nabateans and the Garamantes did. Their legacy offers us a powerful way forward, one built on harmony and intelligence rather than brute force and resource depletion. So the next time you feel a breeze on your face, pause for a moment and consider the invisible forces at play in your own life. Think about the design of your home, the layout of your city, the very air you breathe. How might the unseen patterns of wind and weather be influencing them in ways you never noticed? History is not just a record of what we have done. It is a deep well of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered, reminding us that the most profound innovations often come from learning to work with the world, not against it. We would love to hear your thoughts on these hidden forces. Have you ever seen architecture in your own community that seems to cleverly work with the elements? Share your observations and ideas in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this exploration into history's hidden mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past.